All right. Well, welcome everyone. Again, thanks for joining. I'm Mike Mino. I'm CCI's Communications Director here at the Center for Climate Integrity. And we're here today to discuss the new report, Pennsylvania's Looming Climate Cost Crisis, the rising price to protect communities from extreme heat, precipitation, and sea level rise. We have a number of speakers with us today representing groups who work directly on this study, as well as local elected officials and other local voices. Each of our speakers is going to share a brief opening statement. And then if you would like to ask a question, I'm going to ask members of the media after we're done with opening statements, if you could drop your name and outlet in the Q&A if you have a question. I have the ability as the host to give you audio access so that you can ask your question live to the speakers. And I'll repeat those instructions once we get on the other side of opening statements. But now I'm going to turn it over to introduce the report and our speakers to my colleague, Isla Shorenstein.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning, everyone. My name is Isla Shorenstein, and I'm CCI's Political Director for our state and local programs. So the study that we are very excited to release today is, to our knowledge, the first ever attempt to determine the costs that Pennsylvania municipalities will face to protect infrastructure and communities from climate change. So the team that worked on this study, several of which are on this call, used a variety of data sets and methodologies to look at 8 specific climate impacts related to hotter weather, heavier rain, and rising sea levels. And we calculated how much it would cost more than 2,000 local governments across the state of Pennsylvania to adapt in order to keep residents safe. So we concluded that in total, municipal governments in Pennsylvania face more than $15 billion in climate adaptation costs by 2040. That comes out to nearly $1 billion a year. And notably, half of these costs are related to increasing stormwater drainage capacity, which one of our other speakers will talk about in more depth. And so one of the findings that we hope will be a real wake-up call for elected officials is just how disastrous climate change is going to be on local budgets. We compared the total projected cost to adapt to these 8 impacts with current municipal budgets, and it's truly shocking. So a couple examples of that, Philadelphia is looking at $3.3 billion to address climate resilience and adaptation by 2040, which is equal to over half the annual revenue of the city. Pittsburgh will face $520 million in adaptation costs by 2040, which that equals $31 million in annual climate adaptation costs, or more than Pittsburgh is spending on 23 of the city's 27 departments, including operations and facilities. Nearly 2/3 of those climate expenses, about $22 million a year, are for increasing stormwater drainage capacity, with another $5 million needed to control or to protect against landslides. The situation is even more challenging for lots of smaller governments with even fewer resources all over the state. The other point I want to mention before I hand it over is that the financial burden of climate adaptation will not fall equally on all Pennsylvanians. So using census data, the study analyzed how areas that are more densely populated with vulnerable residents, such as those experiencing poverty or disability, would be hit by climate adaptation costs. We found that residents who live in rural, high poverty, and high disability municipalities, as well as communities defined as environmental justice areas, will face higher climate adaptation costs than the statewide average municipal adaptation cost. Now to talk a little bit more about how we compiled this study, I'm going to introduce one of our co-authors, Dr. Paul Chanowski, who is the Director of Resilient Analytics.
All right. Thank you, Isla. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to be able to talk to everyone. This was a really important study from a technical perspective, in that it was the first time that somebody really went into depth across over 2,000 local municipalities in a number of sectors. This study was done from an engineering perspective. And that's important because the question really becomes, with climate change, not only what is the impact going to happen, but what is it going to take to protect us? The results really reflect the question of what it would take for an individual bridge or building or road or school to function in the environment of tomorrow when compared to the environment for which they were designed and built for 10, 20, 40 years ago. The results that are published that Isla just talked about are conservative in that they show a middle of the road climate scenario. The final cost could in fact be much, much higher. The key takeaways from the study really focus on two driving factors. The temperature is getting hotter, as we all know, look across the country today, and the intensity of storms are getting stronger, which you just lived through. Higher temperatures are not just uncomfortable. They have significant impacts to the infrastructure around us, as this report highlights. Specifically, we are looking at costs associated with energy usage related to air conditioning, not to mention costs of installing it to address hot classrooms, vulnerable populations, and thousands, if not millions, of homes across Pennsylvania. You have increased maintenance of roads that were not designed for extreme heat, and the need for additional cooling centers to provide relief for individuals during heat waves. Similarly, higher intensity rain events are not just inconvenient. They cause significant damage and unfortunately threats to human life. These costs include the need to protect wastewater treatment plants to prevent overflow discharge, protection of roads and bridges from washouts, and we need to strengthen riverbanks to reduce erosion. What we are experiencing today is just a preview of what is coming tomorrow. We need to find the resources to help these adaptations to save lives. That's what you're seeing in the report. It's an engineering perspective. It's conservative. It is what we have to start adapting to. Isla?
Thanks so much, Paul. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is CCI's very own Richard Wiles, president of our organization.
Thanks. Thanks, Isla. Yeah, I'm going to leave the findings and the technical stuff to Paul and Isla and the other speakers, but just want to talk about sort of what we do and how that fits. CCI is dedicated to helping communities and states find the resources to make these adaptations. And really, I guess the way that we have encouraged people to consider is to, consider who should pay, who really should pay this cost, right? If you're talking $1 billion a year, in some cases, tens of millions of dollars, major costs for even big cities like Philadelphia, but small communities across the state, where you're going to see huge budget impacts. Who should pay? Taxpayers, who really didn't do anything to cause the problem other than, turn on the heat or, take the kids to soccer practice, or just live their lives normally. Should they be forced to pay? Should the taxpayers or the constituents of elected officials across the state be forced to pay? Or should the polluters who caused the problem, who knew that their products were going to cause climate change and then lied about it, should they be the ones who at least pay their fair share? And, at CCI, that is the position that we take, that polluters need to pay. It's a very I think, rational and well-established principle in environmental law, and also just morality, that polluters need to pay to clean up the mess that they cause. In this case, the companies that knew their products were going to cause climate change and then lied about it, in our view, need to pay at least some portion of the costs that you're looking at in this study. And remember, this is just the municipal costs. We didn't look at the state costs or the federal costs, or any disaster recovery costs, which are going to make this only worse. And again, I will ask, why should taxpayers be on the hook for this 100%, particularly municipal governments who are stretched usually beyond their means in the first place? So, I just hope that, elected officials across the state, think about that and, consider the options that they have. Just one last thing is we did a poll across the state, asking the questions, who do people think should pay for this? And 90% of Pennsylvanians surveyed think that polluters should pay at least some of the costs. When you get 90% support for anything, I think you can pretty much say that's unanimous. I mean, at that point, there's literally no political opposition that we could detect to having polluters pay at least a portion of those costs. right? Which we would define as their fair share. Let's figure out what that is, and then they should pay it. As far as litigation, which is an option that we think people should consider, about 70% of Pennsylvanians would support litigation against polluters to force them to pay, because I don't think there's a world in which polluters will volunteer to pay. So, with that, I just think I'll hand it back to Isla and just listen to the rest of the speakers.
Thanks, Richard. So we're going to shift gears a little bit. I am thrilled to be joined by several local leaders from the state of Pennsylvania on this call to offer a bit of a local perspective, what this feels like on the ground. And so first, I'm going to introduce Dr. Monica Taylor, who is chair of the Delaware County Council. Take it away, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you, Isla, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm so thankful for this opportunity to discuss climate change and this eye-opening study. Climate change is real. It is now, and this new reality is apparent to more and more Americans with each passing year, as we deal with an ever-increasing number of extreme weather events, no longer theoretical future conditions that we might see in 25, 50, or 100 plus years. These changes are now being seen in our communities here in Delaware County and throughout the region. Our air is getting hotter and more humid. We waver from periods of drought to periods of extreme rainfall, with dangerous storms, high winds, and flooding taking deadly tolls on us. Just last week in Bucks County, which is less than an hour north of here, torrential rains led to a flash flood that claimed the lives of 6 people, with 1 small child still accounted for. 10 years ago, many people would have called this a tragic quirk of weather and nothing more, certainly not climate change. Well, when you begin to experience weather like this every few weeks, when 100-year storms and floods happen over and over, something has changed and it's costing lives. Studies agree that the majority of Americans understand the expected effects of climate change, but few Americans really grasp the economic impact that climate change threatens to have on our lives at the local level. So the impact of climate change can be immediate and tragic, but its effects are also being seen in the less dramatic world of local economies, with our current and projected municipal, county, and state budgets starting to grapple with the costs of damaged infrastructure, increased repairs, accelerated maintenance cycles, high energy costs, and lost productivity and wages. Climate change and extreme weather affects not only government budgets, but are also affecting the budgets, expenditures, investments, and profitability of businesses whose bottom lines and long-term outlooks must grapple with a variety of costs that account for climate change now. Governments and businesses, both large and small, will have to deal with the increasing financial impact of climate change. But ultimately, it is the customer, the taxpayer, it is the parent and the children that will feel the pain of these increased costs. And the CCI study confirms this. When I look at the numbers for communities in Delaware County, the costs are really staggering. Per the report, we collectively face more than $778 million in costs by 2040 to protect our cities, boroughs, and townships from just a small number of expected climate impacts that the study details. Like many parts of Pennsylvania, the highest costs we face in the next 17 years will be increasing our storm drainage capacity at nearly $515 million, and $42 million of that is in the city of Chester alone. Without strong storm drainage protections, flash floods and rising storm waters will sweep away more lives and put more homes and businesses underwater and in jeopardy. These costs are going to have a significant impact on the budgets of all our municipal governments, forcing difficult conversations and tough decisions. The truth is, we all have finite resources, and many other necessary projects and services compete for funding. Addressing any one of these impacts would have a major effect on our budgets. But together, especially since we know climate change won't end in 2040, they pose an incredible challenge. Even if the number in the study aren't exact, They provide a helpful picture of the scale of what we face and need to plan for as a municipal government. The coming economic impact of climate change on residents, if unaddressed, will not only affect all Pennsylvania communities, but it will affect some residents more than others. Climate change exacerbates existing socioeconomic disparities, hitting vulnerable populations the hardest. Lower income communities, in particular, may struggle to recover from climate-related disasters, perpetuating the cycle of poverty and inequality that Delaware County Council has been working hard to address. As individuals, we're reminded of our individual carbon footprints and asked to modify our personal behavior, often from very well-meaning sources. Yes, our individual choices can have collective impacts and can soften the impact of climate change. But this framing of climate change as something that individuals are responsible for and the solution for is wrong. Climate change has not been the result of individual choices. Climate change is a global phenomenon driven by activities on a large scale, including the burning of fossil fuels, deforestation, and agricultural and industrial processes, most of which were set in motion well before many residents were even born. I agree with CCI and this study's findings. It's not fair for this burden of addressing climate change to fall directly on our residents. Polluters should and must pay. In conclusion, the study's findings on the economic impact of climate change on our local communities in Pennsylvania are a wake-up call. We cannot afford to ignore the consequences of inaction. By taking decisive steps now, we can protect our municipalities, stabilize local budgets, and secure the future of our region. Let us stand united in the fight against climate change for the sake of our communities, our children, and the generations yet to come. Thank you, Isla.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor, for sharing all those words with us. We're going to travel to the western part of the state now. I'm going to introduce Mayor Brittany Reno, who is the mayor of Sharpsburg.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's a huge honor, responsibility to speak out on this issue today. And I hope you'll let me take up some time here because this is something that I spend my every waking minute thinking about, stressing about, and some of my sleeping minutes also. So climate change here in Sharpsburg, it's not really a partisan issue, I'm finding. I've been doing this work here for about 10 years now, and I'm finding that it is actually a public safety nightmare and a budgeting crisis that we're dealing with daily here. My name is Brittany Reno. I'm the mayor of Sharpsburg Borough. Sharpsburg is this beautiful little riverfront community right outside of the city of Pittsburgh. It's also one of Allegheny County's most flood-exposed communities, sitting at the bottom of 4 separate watersheds, like a cup at the bottom of 4 funnels. We're recognized by the state DEP as an environmental justice community because we have a very high population of people living in poverty. We have a high population of elders living in the community and people with disabilities as well. The study coming out today from CCI is groundbreaking and something that I've wanted to see for so long, was almost afraid to see, because it shows that no community in our state is going to be spared from the cost of enduring and preparing for and reacting to climate change. It's not just big cities like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, cities that maybe have environmental staff on board. It's small towns like Sharpsburg too that are already struggling to make ends meet. As a smaller, older, densely built community nestled here in the Allegheny Valley, right under a landslide-prone chunk of land, we're no strangers to flooding. But the most dangerous high-volume storms, the ones that are already stretching us thin as communities, are projected to become more frequent and more devastating because of climate change. We're not talking thousands of dollars or even hundreds of thousands of dollars here in Sharpsburg. We're talking millions of dollars multiplied across thousands of municipalities across the state and country. As a region, we're projected to continue experiencing even more extreme heat, extreme precipitation that threatens lives, not to mention municipal budgets. I have neighbors who were rescued by a raft that paddled up to their front door and still haven't entirely cleaned up their housing, gotten their indoor air quality worked out years later. I have neighbors who can't afford to move, and I have neighbors who can't afford to pay thousands of dollars annually for flood insurance, especially with rates rising dramatically year over year. Public safety is one of my primary concerns as mayor. So meeting regularly with the police chief, staying in contact with officers on the ground, talking with community members about how I can help connect them to social services, and of course, being prepared with the emergency management coordination team, all volunteer, for when disasters strike. Climate change and its impacts on my community are the single biggest threats to public safety in Sharpsburg. As the very people and corporations profiting from heavy pollution commissioned and hid from the public for decades the results of studies on their own true catastrophic environmental impact, my community and ones just like it all over the country wrestled with absorbing the cost of doing business. These are communities that absorb the collateral damage that continues to make the air quality here some of the worst and most toxic in the nation. Here in Sharpsburg, we're doing our fair share to be a part of the solution. We have a climate action plan. We studied our local sources of emissions. We're working creatively, collaboratively, cross-sector to address these things. But it's very expensive. We are doing so much locally to attempt to address these problems that are so much bigger than our half of a square mile or our annual budget. Here in Sharpsburg, we're doing our fair share to be part of the solution, but the polluters that got us in this mess and hid the fact that they were having this impact and knew it aren't doing their share. My constituents, my neighbors, our local small businesses, they didn't get us into this. And to me, as an elected official, I take that responsibility very seriously. I think it's morally indefensible that while so many people in Allegheny County here and across our country can hardly afford to stay in their homes or buy an inhaler or go to the emergency room for heat exhaustion, we are facing the existential threat of climate change while some of the biggest corporate polluters continue to make record profits. Part of living in a healthy and functioning society, in my opinion, is being held accountable for the damage you cause others. As a society, as leaders in this region, in this state, as a group of people who live and work together and breathe the same air in Pennsylvania, we need to make the decision about whether the work we do and the decisions we make with the power that we have are to improve life for the people in our communities who have the least, or to maximize corporate polluter executive profits at the expense of the health and safety and economic well-being of all of the rest of us. Something's got to give here, and I know my residents have already given more than they can afford. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayor Reno. And before I introduce our last speaker, I just want to take a minute to say thank you to both Dr. Taylor and to Mayor Reno. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day. I know you're already confronting all of the issues we just mentioned today on top of a host of other critical issues every single second of your day. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And to everyone else, I hope that people listen. I hope they hear what you had to say today. We welcome your perspective so much. So thanks again. And finally, to close us out, I'm going to introduce Joe Minot, who is the Executive Director of the Clean Air Council. Take it away, Joe. Close us out.
Good morning. So I'll know better next time, certainly not to be the one that comes after the last two speakers, because it has both been very emotional to hear what you've had to say and extremely powerful. And I hope people are listening. My name is Joe Minot. I'm the Executive Director and Chief Counsel of the Clean Air Council. The Clean Air Council is a Pennsylvania-wide organization, advocacy organization, and our mission is to protect everyone's right to a healthy environment. Thank you all for joining us today for the release of the Center for Climate Integrity's report. This is a critically important study for Pennsylvania because it is data we've never had before. We simply cannot keep burying our heads in the sand. This is a wake-up call. For almost 50 years, the fossil fuel industry knew their product was causing climate change. Much like the tobacco industry, they engaged in a campaign of misinformation and funded elected officials who were willing to deny climate change. We have some of those very politicians in our own legislature today. We've known for a long time that our communities are paying the price for climate change. But now with today's report, we have a better idea of some of the financial costs to local taxpayers. The assumptions in this report are conservative, and the costs could be much higher. Pennsylvania needs to be ready for what's coming, and we hope this study informs conversations about accountability and funding. Clean Air Council is committed to protecting people's health, and it's important to view many of these, if not all of these adaptation costs, as protecting health and welfare of the residents of Pennsylvania. But the price tag is really staggering. The last few weeks clearly demonstrated the deadly dangers caused by flash floods. People are literally dying because of heavier precipitation, the study identifies. While comprehensive, it is important to remember that the study only looks at 8 climate change impacts, making it a conservative estimate. There are dozens of additional impacts that are not factored in. Some of the additional impacts that are extremely harmful to public health are wildfire smokes, ozone pollutions, and things like that. Not a day goes by in Pennsylvania where the health of residents is not impacted by climate change. The bottom line is the fossil fuel companies have to be held accountable to pay for the harm they have and are continuing to have on Pennsylvania taxpayers. Fossil fuel companies have known about these impacts of climate change for decades and gaslight the American public with their PR campaigns downplaying the climate crisis. They caused the problem. They must pay to clean it up. Anything less is unacceptable. It is time for Pennsylvania elected officials at all levels of government to stand up to the bullying and the lying of the fossil fuel industry and make them clean up their mess. Local governments need to band together to ensure that fossil fuel companies and not taxpayers are the ones paying for these critical resiliency measures. Thank you.
Right. Thanks again to all our speakers. I know we have some members of the media tuning in right now. If any of you have questions, what I'm going to ask is if you see where you can raise your hand, I'll be able to call on you and allow you to ask your question in the participant chat box. So if anyone does have a question for any of our speakers, please just raise your hand. I'll add that we're also recording today's webinar and we'll make it available afterwards. All right, well, last call, I'm not seeing any hands raised. But for anyone that does have follow-up questions or anything about the report, again, I'm Mike Mino, I'm CCI's Communications Director. You can email me at mike@climateintegrity.org. And we thank you all for joining. Take care.